Hello, everyone. I'm Christine Ying, a software product manager based in San Francisco Bay Area. Over the years, I worked at Apple, Yahoo, TechCrunch, and a number of e-commerce companies. Fun fact, Professor Guthrie and I first crossed that path at Apple while I was working on Apple Maps in China. Earlier this year, we decided to team up on a book exploring U.S. China relations, how they're shaping the tech world. But there's a twist. Every week, as we sit down to work on the book, we get sidetracked by the latest news. These discussions are so fascinating and timely, and we thought, why not share them with you all? And this is how our China in the News series was born.
Christine, so great to be with you. I'm so thankful for the collaboration and you know just finding you. I mean, we were, as you mentioned, we were friends at friends, colleagues, collaborators at Apple in China, and we came back together and thinking about these issues very recently. And wow, this is such an important time for U.S.-China relations. It's such an important time for thinking about technology. The larger project we're working on, U.S.-China relations and technology, and thinking about companies like Apple in China and TikTok in the United States and TSMC in Phoenix. This is just really the thing that drives me right now. And so I'm so thankful for your collaboration on both the larger project, but also this discussion.
Thank you. This is something fresh and exciting for both of us, and we're so glad you're here. China in the News. In China in the News, we break down the week's biggest headline about China and what it means for the world, especially the tech industry. Professor Guthrie will bring his expert analysis and decades of experience as a China scholar, and I'll add my perspective on the tech trenches. Together, we aim to make these conversations informative, thought-provoking, and maybe a little fun. So let's focus on this week's big news. President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping met on the sidelines of the APEC summit in Lima, Peru on November 16th. They met for 2 hours talking about issues from trade to Taiwan, cybersecurity, and North Korea. With President Biden nearing his end of his term, Xi's comments signaled important overture, a readiness to work with the incoming administration. So, Professor Guthrie, just to set some context, what does this meeting tell us about the current state of U.S. China relations, particularly given the pending transition to the Trump administration?
So thanks for the question, Christine. And it is such an important time. And forgive me if I say this too many times, but I want to just say it for our audiences. In my opinion, this is the most important time in U.S.-China relations in the last 30 years. And the reason I say 30 years is because 1994 was the year that the Clinton administration brought in the engagement policy with China, which ultimately led to China's entry into the WTO. And it was a big, big changing moment. And all of us in the China community were very excited. Like, okay, things are moving in a good direction, and we're going to help get China into the WTO, and things are going to be great. We didn't foresee what was going to happen with the election of President Xi Jinping, and so that was a little, and as you know, Christine, like I had the opportunity to go work for Tim Cook and Joel Podolny and be the head of Apple University in China and sort of think through that period from 2014 to 2019. And during that time, President Trump came to power in 2016, and it was just a dark time for a lot of us in terms of thinking like, wow, okay, trade wars, wow, 300 billion in tariffs, wow, like there's a lot of stuff that happened during that time. Now, after Trump went out of office in 2020 and Biden came into power, we, I was hopeful, like I was hopeful about an engagement policy. Now, what we've seen in the last 3 years or 4 years, we've seen President Trump and President Biden meet 3 times, right? And they've all been meetings around the APEC summit. Now, so I want to address your question about Lima, Peru, but one more just sort of harkening back moment. Um, a year ago, so November 2023, President Xi got on a plane and flew from Beijing, cap in hand, to come to San Francisco to meet
It was
with,
actually Faloli Garden, Woodside, near my house.
yes, yeah. And not only did he meet with President Biden, but he met with Gavin Newsom and business leaders. And
Yes.
for me, I mean, this was long before we realized that Trump was going to be the next president of the United States. For me, it was an auspicious time because I was like, okay, things are back on track. We are doing this. It's going to be okay. Right. And just so you know, I think you know this about me, Christine, but I'll say for our audience, I'm an engagement policy person. Like I fundamentally believe that, the one China policy was signed in 1979 under Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping. And we believed in the engagement of economic development. The 80s was sort of just a period in which China was sort of opening its doors, but the 90s was really a period of engagement, of joint venture relationships and technology transfer development. And then we got China into the WTO in 2001, and doors were open. And the company that you and I used to work for, Tim Cook took Apple into China in 2001. Like it was a wide open, it was a really exciting time, right? And so then things got more tense under Xi Jinping, and we've been through that period, and you and I will talk about that another time. But to go back to the question of Biden and Xi in Lima, again, it's sort of remarkable to me that the two largest economies in the world, and for many years, the two largest trading partners, that this is only the third time that these two presidents have seen each other. And this one, I think is an important meeting because it's, a meeting, it's the last time that they're going to meet as the leaders of the two largest economies in the world. But the shadow of the Trump administration looms large here, right? And so, like, what this meeting has basically been about is both figuring out, like, how do we continue to make a case for engagement, but how do we also think about, like, okay, what does it mean that Marco Rubio and Matt Waltz and a number of other people who are, you know, China hawks are going to be in the room. And so I think what's happening in this particular meeting, Christine, is that President Biden is trying to calm the stage and trying to sort of usher out and make it clear that there's going to be a peaceful transition. It's going to be easy. Um, and my guess is that I have no inside information on this, but my guess is that behind the scenes, they're saying, everybody calm down. This thing about 60% tariffs, like it's not, everybody, these people are smart business people and they understand the intertwined nature of our economies. And
Well,
so,
speaking of tariffs, she pledged stability and cooperation despite the proposed tariff. How might China counteract these policies, and what could be the global economic impact? I know that between you and me, we talked about tariff actually hurt consumers. Could you kind of elaborate on how China can actually counteract these policies?
yeah. So it's a great question, Christine. And again, so you and I have talked about this, but let me just say it for our watchers. This idea that, or the statement by people like President-elect Trump and JD Vance that tariffs are a tax on China is a lie. It's just incorrect. And I think these people are smart business people, so I think they know that this is not the case. China doesn't pay the tax of tariffs. Companies importing into the United States from China pay the tax. So Apple has about 90% of its production in China, right? And so when they export iPhones from China to the United States, all of that tax, and in this case for Apple, it's a 25% tax, goes to Apple. And Apple is a corporate client that thinks about its shareholders. And so they're not going to eat that money. Like they're going to pass it on to consumers. And so iPhones then prices are raised 25%. That's how it works. Anybody who says differently, whenever Donald Trump or JD Vance says this is a tax on China, it's a lie. It's a tax on companies exporting from China to the United States. And just to be very clear on this, so we have the Apple example, we have the Tesla example. Walmart is the single largest exporter from China to the United States, right? And so and these are light industry goods, but still consumer prices are going to be raised 25%. And so when we're thinking about things like inflation, tariffs are bad. They don't harm China. Now, there is a logic, as you and I have talked about this before, but there is a logic of how tariffs work. If tariffs increase prices of imports from other countries such that it equalizes prices with American manufacturing, then people may buy American and create more jobs in the US manufacturing supply chain. The problem is we don't have the US manufacturing supply chain anymore. After 1980 and 1990, all of those jobs went to places like China and India and Southeast Asia. And so the idea of tariffs is not a horrible idea, but it only works if it is effectively executed such that it creates jobs in America. Now, the one interesting thing about tariffs, and I feel like this point is often missed, the Trump 300 billion general tariffs, I just think are ridiculous. Biden's 18 billion in tariffs on the electric vehicle industry is interesting because it raises prices for BYD products that are being brought into the United States. But Tesla is the main competitor here, and Tesla does have manufacturing supply chain in the United States. So if you're raising the prices of the BYD goods such that people might say, okay, BYD, Tesla, they're sort of equal in price. Maybe I'll just buy the Tesla. You are creating jobs. So it's not that I think tariffs are fundamentally bad. I just think they need to be used strategically, right? Now, to get back to your sort of broader question about like what is going to happen here, or so the tariffs are one issue, but I also think that there are strategic issues that are really about engagement. We just have to be deeply engaged here. And this is what I worry about with the new administration. Now, I've calmed myself down a little bit post-election because I think these people are business people and they are going to know what could happen to the US economy if the trade war gets really bad. And so you asked the question, Christine, what could China do? I'll tell you what China can do. And you and I know this case very well. They could make life very hard for companies like Apple and Tesla. And given that Elon Musk is very big with the Trump administration right now, and I'm sure that Tim
He's
Cook
called the
has
first buddy. He's been
he's the
nicknamed
first
first
buddy.
buddy.
And given that, back to my time with working with Apple, I know that we had, Donald Trump's phone number. Like, they cannot see Apple and Tesla and Walmart get kicked out of China. It can't happen because there is not that this is the reason that companies like Apple are the most profitable company in the world is because of the sort of powerful nature of the manufacturing supply chain that they're embedded within China. And so China has leverage. They're going to be able to counter this. And then the business people, the Trumps and Vances of the world, they're going to see it and they're going to back down. And so I think the tariffs are just not going to happen.
Yeah, one example is if Stanley Cup is $25 in Walmart right now. After the tariff, it'll probably be 33.99, and it actually hurts the consumer rather than help.
Right.
Hey, let's move on to the restriction on US technology exports since I'm from the tech industry. How is Beijing likely to respond strategically to Biden administration restriction on the US investment in Chinese AI, quantum computing, and semiconductors? And how might this impact global supply chain and technology leadership over the next decade?
So I have to tell you, Christine, I love the question. I'm not a fan of the CHIPS Act. And I know that the CHIPS Act was set up so that we could sort of protect technology, and it goes back more than a decade because before the CHIPS Act, there was, you know, and before the attacks on TikTok and ByteDance, there were attacks on Huawei, right? And so the basic idea was like, if we are building high technology that is related to the flow of data, we have to be very careful because even if Huawei is a private company, privately held company, and yes, Ren Zhengfei, the founder of Huawei, was a member of the People's Liberation Army, and he was a Communist Party member, but that doesn't mean he's giving data to the Chinese government, right? And
It's
so,
right, but President Biden has described these steps as necessary for US national security, and while they do not impede most trade.
yes, but again, I would rather us be engaged and sort of collaborating. So one of the things that, just to go back to the Huawei example, we've excluded Huawei from the US market. The CHIPS Act has made it very clear that it's not only Huawei being excluded, but US firms and US partner firms in other countries are not allowed to sell any technology to Huawei. Which, okay, so you make that decision and you think about it as security. in my view, what that means is we're pushing Huawei to be more innovative, and they're developing their own chips, right? And so they're going to be fine. Like, so we're not hurting Huawei in any way, but what we've lost is a partnership, right? And so I actually think, again, I'm a strategic engagement guy. Like, I just think economic engagement is the best way to know what your competitors are doing. And whether those competitors are other companies or they're other countries, the best way to know what they're doing is to be partners with them, right? That's a whole ban, right? And so, like, I just think partnership is the best way to do this. And so I just think the CHIPS Act, yeah, okay. So we've excluded companies like Huawei and a couple of others, and like we're focusing on companies like, TSMC and Nvidia and Intel. Great. But I would rather us all be in rooms together talking about strategic engagement and thinking about the flow of data and technology and the flow of technology that could have access, could be accessible by other countries, but we've decided as like a capitalist global economic system, we're not going to allow that to happen. And so I'd rather be in the room having those negotiations. And that's just my view.
Makes sense. Well, let's go back to the summit. So President Xi arrived in Lima. He's planning a 1 week long diplomatic travel throughout Latin America. So, how does China's growing presence in Latin America challenge traditional U.S. influence in that region? And what strategy might Washington adopt to maintain its foothold while countering China's economic and political advances? This is the same could be said about Africa. Um, China has invested quite in African countries. So I'd love to hear you talk about kind of China's growing presence in Latin America and Africa.
So, Christine, I love the question because this is, my students will tell you this is my hobby horse right now, right? So the it is so important to understand sort of the global economic hierarchy and how China feels about the global economic hierarchy and the big change that's happening right now. So first of all, one of the things that I always is one of my hobby horses is, it's offensive that we have the G7, right? And the G7 is these nations that are capitalist democracies. And, we think about sort of besides the UN, like these are the capitalist democracies that are on a little table running the world, right? And oh, we have this other group called the G20. And you guys are sort of the kids' table. Like you don't get to be a part of the G7, but you can be a part of this little group over here. And we'll come and talk to you guys and help advise you on what you should do. Now, the argument when the G7 was formed was that, well, this is capitalist democracies, right? And so there's a reason why it is the nations it is. But we know that that was a lie because in 2008, the G7 changed the G8 and they let Russia in, right? Because Russia had a lot of access to oil and, it was a powerful nation in the world. And so the argument that this is just capitalist democracies was false. And then, of course, Russia was kicked out in 2013 because of Crimea. But, we'd already sort of gone up to the line and gone over it. It's not about capitalist democracies. It's just about what the G7 thinks that they want and need. And so, China, you're important. You're the second largest economy in the world, but you can still be at the kids' table. This is offensive to people in the Chinese government, right? So, companies like China, which is the second largest economy in the world, India, which is the fifth largest economy in the world, both of these nations have about 1.4 billion people. So, we're talking about, more than a third of the world's population. Wow. And they're at the kids' table. Okay. Now, the interesting thing about what you're mentioning, Christine, is I, I think people in the US don't realize how important the BRICS movement is, right? So, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That was the initial sort of little group. And often people say, why South Africa? Well, it's because of access to Africa, right? And so like they needed some place in Africa and they didn't really understand what like so they but let's put South Africa. But this year, Christine, has been a huge year for China diplomatically and for the BRICS because first we are seeing Xi Jinping kind of coming out as a world diplomat, right? Like we're going to go down in history with Xi Jinping having brokered the peace deal, a 20-year conflict brokered the peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. That was Xi Jinping, right? It wasn't Biden. It wasn't any of the other G7 leaders. It was Xi Jinping, right? Now, there's also this issue of the Belt and Road Initiative, right? And a lot of people think the Belt and Road Initiative is just China creating, debt traps and, building roads, but creating indebtedness. And, you know, just to be a little fair to China, the U.S. under the Marshall Plan has created debt relationships with many developing nations. And so, like, this isn't a new thing. But people often think, well, Belt and Road Initiative is just about that. Belt and Road Initiative is about a pivot away from China's reliance on its trade relationship with the United States and the G7, right? And so they are building a whole infrastructure that is going to be about what the term, but in Chinese we say Nannan Hezuo, which means South-South cooperation. Nannan Lingdao. China wants to be the South-South leader, right? And so that's an interesting move for China. And then again, to come back to your question, I think BRICS is huge, right? The fact that BRICS was expanded this year, so beyond just Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, it was expanded by 5 nations,
Saudi
right?
Arabia, UAE, Argentina, Egypt,
Yeah.
Iran, and Ethiopia.
Yeah. So
So
look at that.
why
So now it's not
why do
Brazil
these
and
countries, what are they interested in getting from BRICS membership?
they're interested in getting the leadership of a whole different trading system that's not dominated by the United States and the G7. And so I think this is a big movement. And I think you and I have talked about this before, but I'll just mention it here. Again, this is a really auspicious moment, not just because this year the China's negotiation of the arrangement with Iran and Saudi Arabia, the expansion of the BRICS by 5 nations, but also the softening of relationships between China and India, right? So the border dispute has just been solved. And my guess is that what we're going to see is a lot more collaboration between India and China. And it's going to be interesting. I think the world, including the United States, is going to need to wake up to see what's happening in the trading system because so anyway, just to get back to Lima, I don't know how much was talked about that between Biden and Xi, but I think like these are the looming issues, right? So you could have Biden and Xi coming together one more time, and then you could have Trump and Vance talking about 60% tariffs, which again I think is fallacy and it's not going to happen. And then you have BRICS, right? And so I think it's a really interesting moment, Christine. This is a really great conversation, and I thank you for it.
Thank you. That was awesome. So, everyone, we're taking a short break next week to celebrate Thanksgiving, and we'll be back the following week with more content. In the meantime, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next conversation. Wishing you and your loved one a wonderful Thanksgiving. See you soon.
Thank you,
Bye.
Christine.
We should stop the recording.